Welcome to Show Studio. It's the couture show, so it's always the lovely panels where we get to look at absolutely sort of breathtaking fashion and think a lot about, you know, the future of craft in fashion, the future of haute couture, which is kind of the linchpin of fashion, and look at some of the work of the most talented designers. So it's a really exciting sort of fashion week to be analysing. It's our first panel, and what better way to kick it off than a chat about the Dior show, which is always a brilliant one because of the very, very talented Raf Simons. And I've also aptly got a set of very talented people with me to talk about Raf. So before we start sort of chatting about what he's up to and about the House of Dior and about couture in general, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, starting with you, Lucy.
Hi, my name's Lucy Norris. I'm a fashion historian and trend forecaster.
I'm Oriole Cullen and I'm a curator of fashion at the Victoria and Albert Museum.
And I'm Rosie Wallin and I'm a designer and a researcher and lecturer at St Martin's.
Thanks for coming, guys. It feels nice for me actually to look at this because I was in Paris this morning and there is something so Parisian about couture and about Dior, so it always gets me really excited to talk about. But it got me thinking when I was on the Eurostar back about couture because it's kind of the first day, so you know, and there have been a couple of shows already. There was Versace last night, which was very sort of glamorous, and then you know, we've had Schiaparelli today, so it's kind of it's the first few shows, and it got me thinking about sort of what couture has to be today to be good. And I don't really know what I mean when I say good, whether that just means to someone like me, a fashion journalist, or whether it is to a buyer, you know, I mean a couture client. What do we think couture has to do to sort of succeed, and what is succeeding with couture these days? Because it's hard to say, isn't it? You know, in some respects it's not the sales, it's the sale of lipsticks and perfumes off the back of it. So what makes good couture? That's a very big question, but...
Well, I think looking at the last Dior couture show was really interesting because it's a move away from that sort of the big evening dress, which you know we always associate with that, and I think that's what Raf Simons has done so well. We don't know yet what we're about to see, but you know that there's beautiful, beautiful tailored coats and trousers, just you know really covetable, wearable day wear. It's not automatically what you associate with it, and I think that's really looking at a contemporary market and making it relevant in a way, which is quite interesting. With
an institution like the V&A, do you find when you speak to people who come into the fashion galleries who perhaps aren't that versed in fashion, when they think of couture, do they think of those big dresses, do you think?
I think a lot of it is that. Yeah. I mean, of course, if you go back to, you know, the pre-war era, haute couture was, you know, the high fashion. Everything was handmade, and that included day wear and evening wear. But I think in the post-war period, it's veered more and more. Certainly the coverage and the things that we see are the more elaborate and fantastic gowns. So I think that's what people really associate with it. And perhaps for a while the client was, you know, buying things that were sort of stupendous evening wear. So
it's interesting, isn't it? Because kind of going back to the first point I made about this, kind of the two aims of couture in a way. One of them is to sell couture to couture clients, and one of them is to sort of create enough press and enough spectacle and enough drama to get people to sort of see the brand, acknowledge the brand, and buy into it with things like, as I said, perfumes and lipsticks. So it's interesting because you think it's intriguing to see less focus on these huge gowns, but then I wonder to someone who wants to be sort of inspired by couture and go and buy a perfume because of it, whether they then find couture strange. What do you guys think about sort of how couture is changing?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like you said. There's the client, and then there's the you know, there's the sort of the pyramid, if you like, isn't there, in terms of couture being the little sort of the icing on the cake, the ballerina on the cake, or what have you, that inspires then that big volume of sort of perfumes and handbags to be sold so the house can survive. But I don't know whether they make much money out of couture in terms of the clientele sort of profitability. I think once you've made these dresses, I think they're so kind of, well, they are, of course, they're so time consuming to make. As a business, I don't know whether it wouldn't be there, I don't think, in terms of that business model. I'm not sure that would work. So I do think that it's interesting that you said, like you said, that those sort of kind of clients that have historically been much older and old money would have wanted the theatricality of a big gown to make the statement. But I think that where fashion brands are now, they're trying to sort of reignite these old labels. So maybe this is why they've got then the capacity and the courage to start relating couture to sort of younger markets and younger clientele for couture. But I think primarily couture does have to sort of fall in line, if you like, with the with the contemporary world, and that is that we are mixing up sort of trainers with sort of ball gowns, or some of us are. But you know, it's that idea. But you know, but you can wear trainers on a night out.
Yeah.
You know now, and it's all that and that athleticism that they had to sort of represent. And I mean, but that's been happening for a very long time. If you look back at sort of Yves Saint Laurent and that notorious collection Dior, where he was inspired by the Left Bank and you know, and it's that idea that and the beatniks. And that effectively, you know, Dior was so utterly, the house was so utterly devastated by what Yves Saint Laurent did. They actually, removed his sort of immunity to conscription into the army, which is then what gave him the breakdown. They were that furious, they sacked him and put him in the army because he took inspiration from the streets.
I hope that never happens to Raf Simons.
But isn't it interesting that you kind of sort of see how far couture's come?
Yeah. You were nodding along there to a lot of
I was just thinking that he's sort of taken an opposite trajectory in a way, because he started out influenced by the street, didn't he? And kind of punk and, you know.
Rap,
yeah, and then he's kind of gone to the heart of the fashion establishment by taking on this big corporate job. So it's kind of the opposite in a way.
It's really interesting. I was going to ask kind of about that and about what we see in that and in that contradiction, because I think that was particularly pertinent this fashion week, because we just saw his men's collection, which, you know, was very much focused on his youth and, as always, you know, the sense of tribes and groups.
Subcultures.
But subcultures. But he put women in it for the first time. And yes, they were wearing men's clothes, but it was very interesting. It got me thinking about the interplay between what he's doing at Dior and what he does at his old house, and how you balance that, firstly, as a designer, whether you should keep them separate or whether you can keep them separate. I don't know, have we noticed a kind of communication between the two?
I think it's very fluid, or it seems to be with him, it's very fluid and two-way, because you imagine that there was an element, or maybe he imagined that he was going to bring this kind of youth to couture, but then you see the influence of his couture work on his own line as well. So it's obviously a kind of two-way conversation, which is quite interesting.
Is there an irony, though, in a way, to having sort of someone who's so... I think because it's weird when you go to one of his men's shows, like, he does still feel almost like an outsider, which is really weird, because he's obviously he's such a part of the fashion establishment, and I'm kind of interested in the cult of Raf and how he's maintained that sense of always being a little bit out of it, you know, a little bit...
Isn't that wonderful?
It's amazing.
It's really wonderful to be able to sort of keep that, you know, that unknown kind of nicheness, and that's what keeps you special as a brand. If you can stay below the radar. I mean, I'm not saying Raf is below the radar, but it's really interesting, you know, in terms of perfume sales. I was thinking about this earlier on. All the people that, you know, I don't know who they are. I'm from up north, and everybody that's up north buying Chador or whatever, Chador Dior, they don't know who Raf is. They just don't know. And I think there's a real anonymity about him still, which kind of keeps him, he's straddling both worlds, which is really
It's interesting
clever.
to think of those girls, because it goes back to, I think, what I was getting at the start, which is, I think what's interesting to think about couture having to become relevant, and as you used a really good term, which is kind of fall in line with what's happening in fashion. But then I think about how we look at couture, and, you know, and the effect that the internet has had on fashion, how we see everything as a flat image now, and it's interesting because I wonder, to women who just want to have their breath taken away, it's almost harder to do that than ever before. It's hard to do something spectacular when you only see it in an image. And I just wonder about whether this process of kind of couture becoming modernised, whether it's harder to do something spectacular. I've thought...
You mean we're homogenising it?
Yeah, well, not even that so much. You know, if you do a big gown, I know it's simplistic, but of course it does look very dramatic and very shocking, whereas when you do something that's kind of shorter or more relevant, I just wonder if it has that same resonance to your average person looking at it. I think I've thought about that with the Chanel collection, last season, when they did all that concrete beading. It was amazing, but it just didn't come across, and I didn't think that, you know, a person, anyone, looking at it online would have gone, God, that is spectacular, in the same way that they would a big dress.
But I think also the couture houses know what's happening with their markets and their clients, and I think actually it's very strong at the moment. And I think, you know, globally we're all so much better informed about fashion than we were, and I think that, you know, there's a lot of money around and there's a younger client and they understand, you know, for us it's about seeing that spectacular thing and thinking, wow, that's the height of, you know, skill, but actually for the client it's about those amazing trousers that, you know, are made on your body and look amazing. And so I think there is that sense that they can go there now. They can be slightly braver in a way of not having to go out all out because they know there is a client for something that's a little more low-key in a way.
But do you think, like what Lou was saying, that it's possible that on Instagram or what have you, that silhouette and colour is grabbable much, you know, to understand sort of like a detailing online. People want that immediate, oh, that's the colour of the season, that's the silhouette I want to be wearing, and Topshop will scale back or whatever and make it wearable. And I think that hype around couture in the sense of the ateliers, it's not actually, it's not a mass message. You know, it's not appreciated by.
Which I thought was interesting with what Margiela did, or John Galliano from Margiela did, because obviously he kind of kicked off couture before, making life easy for us all. When he actually sent the toiles down the runway, and I thought that was really smart, and it got me thinking about, you know, ways to make people understand couture and understand all that happens behind it, because that never seems to be a story that well told, and I don't know if that's just my perception, but I feel like the craft side is often something that isn't communicated enough.
I think that's also particularly important now that the boundaries are more blurred between the different sort of layers, the cake or whatever, then that story becomes more important.
Well, it's interesting because when Raf did the first collection, you know, the biggest criticism a lot of people kind of said, I think quite flippantly, was, oh, it just looks like ready to wear. And I was kind of like, yes, but is that is that an insult or is that a criticism, because an insult or a compliment? Because if it looks like ready to wear, in a way, great, because a couture client wants to look like she's going about her day, and you shouldn't maybe look at couture and immediately go, oh, that is couture. It's how it feels. So it's just interesting, isn't it, to think of kind of.
But when we did the Dior panel last summer, when we were looking at the last, I think we really wrestled with that.
Yeah.
Because we were like, oh, it's really wearable and great, but it doesn't look like how couture's supposed to look. And it's like we're still coming out of that kind of sort of era, and we're very much attached to the couture that we've grown up with. And like you said, really, it's all that sort of putting something from the 18th century with like a pair of Bermuda shorts. And Raf, I mean, even within one season, I could see like Chanel cleaning up, you know, I don't mean cleaning up making money, I mean cleaning up like cleaning up.
Cleaning up.
No, they're really cleaning up, I'm sure. But it's the idea of their lines were cleaning, they were using sequins, embroidery and beading in a more sort of minimal.
It's just this lightness of touch.
And they caught on to this sort of thing that Raf does so well, where he sort of has this sort of he actually, one of the lady that was doing his PR a few years ago said to me that Raf's aim is to make he said to her, why can't the future be romantic? And ever since she's told me that, I'm like, wow, that's just totally what he's trying to do.
That's one of those things that makes my brain ache, because then I start thinking, like,
it's incredible, isn't it? But you know, all that kind of idea of putting sort of, you know, blurring the year, you know, 3000 with the year, the 18th century, and he's widening out his references. I mean, he's obsessed with mid-20th century couture, but now, you know, you can see he's delving into sort of what influenced Dior from the 18th century, and he's got this futuristic,
which is exactly what this is about, actually.
Sportsy kind of eye, and he's going even further. But to have that ability to be able to sort of collect all of those references, but yet to not make it look clunky, to not make it look too space-agey and retro in a sense, but to genuinely make it feel contemporary. He's such an incredible tastemaker that I feel goes beyond fashion. You know, people I think are looking at his collections from film, art direction, whatever kind of that they're in. He's really galvanising sort of, he's very historically entrenched in key eras that really matter to now, but he's making it look so pretty and desirable at the same time.
Yeah, I think he always has that sort of, it feels like he can take things from the past, but he's always looking to the future, and I think that's why he can do it with a relevance that doesn't look like costume. You think, oh well, it's great, you know, that he's he's pushing it and saying, if we take 18th century silks, or if we take, how can we make that good for now?
It's interesting. It's so interesting. I thought about that so much this season because it was something that happened all across the menswear, which is just this kind of obsession with the past, but also the fact that the past kind of perversely feels more modern than things that are intended to be modern. And I found that a really interesting idea. You know, we saw so many clothes that were veered towards costume, you know, like flares everywhere and kind of pieces that were really sort of built around a particular era. But also this idea of time was something that a lot of designers played with. J.W. Anderson did it in London, this idea of, it's a very similar ethos to Raf in a sense, which is this idea of deliberately mixing eras and almost deliberately getting it wrong, putting things with things that shouldn't go together. And I just wonder why that is having such a moment, whether it is kind of a post-Tumblr thing, you know, this idea of pulling references from everywhere, whether, you know, why does the past feel so right and so new? It's really weird, isn't it, when you think that you're obsessed with stuff like this?
Sorry?
You're obsessed with stuff like this, postmodernism.
Oh yeah, no, sorry, I mean literally just turn the cameras off, I'll talk about it.
But why does it feel so right?
Well, because we are, I don't want to say too much because I'm consulting on quite a lot of this at the moment, but it's a really key era in terms of, it's like 50 years since a lot of incredible things happened in the late 60s and Raf's tapping into all of that culturally.
Yeah.
So, and him as well as lots of huge film directors and creative directors, he's up there thinking about where we are now. So there's lots of anniversaries. You know, it's interesting. This year celebrates 600 years since the death, or 400 years, sorry, I might have got that figure wrong, since the death of Shakespeare. So he's got, you know, it's into that, but then also there's things like it's, you know, 50 years since Star Trek was created. And there's a lot of that in his work.
Yeah.
The Cold War.
It's this weird mass though, isn't it? But I just wonder, like, mishmash. I wonder where, I don't know, how we're dealing with the past is really interesting. I think it's changed quite rapidly. You know, I was thinking about it with Marc Jacobs because I feel like there's designers who treat the past in really interesting ways, and he is one of them. But he kind of picks a decade and runs with it, and there's kind of we're not seeing that anymore now. You know, it would feel quite passé, I think, to do a collection. Although we did see it a bit in some of the menswear shows, to do like, you know, a 70s collection or an 80s collection. Time is being treated in a really interesting way.
Yeah, there is lots of time.
Oh God.
Don't get me into it. I'm really getting
Who are the
into
masters of time
stuff.
though within fashion? Is it something that you've thought about, you're interested in?
Well, I think Margiela definitely is a master of time.
That's
I mean, the kind of exhibition that he did, remember the one with all the garments that had the mould growing on them? I mean, really fascinating. He's really interesting. He's a master of time, I think. But obviously that's much more conceptual, and I think what's interesting about the way that Raf works, even though he was very influenced by Margiela, he says that in all the interviews, doesn't he?
Yeah.
That he was kind of, he went to see that show in '97, and that kind of made him realise that fashion could be so much more than just this sort of superficial thing, that it could be thought about in a much deeper way. But what he does is, I think he makes it a lot more accessible.
Yeah.
I think Margiela still can scare people a little bit. And so I think he's the next generation on from the Antwerp Six, isn't he?
Yeah. It's really interesting you said about making it accessible, because I do feel, you know, my little theory that I came up with over the men's, that the designers who feel most current and most modern and most interesting are the ones who who can play on time and the past in the most interesting way. And I think, you know, Prada does it really well, and JW, I think that's why he's been so successful. And it just got me thinking about that, and how you use those kind of retro things without making it seem too lofty or too kind of academic. And I don't think his work ever feels, there's really light.
It is light, and I think there's the sort of the designers that designers like, and then there's the designers that people want to wear quite often, and they're not always the same, which is interesting.
Where does Raf fit in that, do you think?
Well, I think he's definitely something, a designer that people want to wear.
But he is a designer's designer as well. It's interesting, isn't it?
Sort of in the on the cusp.
Yeah, but that kind of decade mixing and that blending.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're lost. Sorry, we are culturally lost at the moment. But actually, that's really amazing, because you know, it takes about 20 years for a century to really start warming up and to know what it's really all about. And we're at the beginning of a millennium, new millennium. So it's really exciting, because we're just like, you know, we were excited about the future in the 1960s. We were excited about the future in the 90s, I had a little Go Green into the 90s t-shirt in 1991. And we thought, you know, we were thinking about the ozone layer again and all that kind of stuff. And in the 60s, it was, you know, space age kind of hugeness. But now you see we're sort of leaping forward, but we're looking back to when we thought. So there's lots of looking back to key eras like the 60s and the 70s, when we were also thinking about
it's that really weird thing, isn't it? It's looking back to when people were looking forward.
Yeah, so it's
really
this idea
strange.
of, and it's a postmodern construct of the no future past. So the idea is that there is no future. So you looked, it's very Bowie, and that's very
There's some Bowie references going on in here.
So it's wonderful.
What do you think about it? Because you work, you know, surrounded by objects from the past, and is it quite weird to look at all these collections and, I guess in a way, see references treated quite lightly, you see ages kind of smashed together. Is it something you quite enjoy, I guess?
Well, I think it's what Lucy was saying, that is it a question that actually there's nothing new anymore? We've run out, so we're now furiously backpedaling and you know, taking all these references, which creates something amazing in itself too. But I think it's very interesting that the decades have become codes in a way. So you look at Vuitton and you say 70s or say, you know, late 60s, or, all of these things that we suddenly can hang a hook on and we know that's what that is. And I think maybe it is also to do with the internet, that people have those references now and people can, you know, relate to that.
And I think it feels new as well. I was thinking about that a lot with I think a generation that have always had the internet, and how actually a lot of old stuff does genuinely feel really new because they've never seen it before. So actually,
that's the other thing.
It's really interesting to think about it like that.
There is no history beyond the 1990s to the 18-year-old.
I know, it's really strange, but then that's why you think something like the 70s, which is everywhere at the moment, feels so fresh and so exciting, because it's actually not that Googleable in a weird way. Do you know what I mean? There's this weird point I always think about it with collections, and some of the collections that you've seen most sort of ripped off and referenced by fashion students, they're always the ones that are online. And I always think you do so well in your exams if you just bothered to go read a book, and even just got the collections from 2 years before Style.com and everyone started putting them all online. It's really interesting. Talking of young people, actually, just why does Raf, because I think Raf is one of those designers where you talk to a lot of fashion students or young people and they really, really love his work, and I wondered what it is that makes a designer because that's such an interesting thing to be a designer that young people look to and think is really amazing.
I think it is the outsider thing. I think it is because he did furniture, didn't he?
Yeah, he's a furniture designer.
And so he's got a sort of an irreverence about him, perhaps, which is kind of light and, you know, a little bit humorous. It's not too heavy, taking himself too seriously. So
I think he's quite a serious designer. I think he's had some dark, melancholic moments, very dark.
He's a very emotional man, which I love.
Emotional. He cries after every show, apparently.
I know, it's so sweet.
I love somebody with a heart. In fashion.
You watched, there's a really good YouTube clip when he won the CFDA award, I think it was, and he's giving his speech. And you'd have to be like dead inside not to be moved by watching it. He's just so sweet and he's so happy and it's so cute. I love him.
But he says that he wants to bring the emotion back into couture, doesn't he? That was his kind of mission, really, is to bring feeling back into it. And,
which is very different to, we often talk on these panels about the idea of narrative fashion being dead or storytelling being dead. And I think it's interesting to bring emotion in, because that is actually very different to storytelling, but it's equally as kind of exciting. And he doesn't storytell, I don't think, but then he also does, but it's never kind of a obvious, like this is beginning, middle, and end, this is the girl. It's more storytelling.
Well, what I think is interesting about him is that he talks quite a lot about, well, not a lot, but he talks more than a lot of designers about actually the woman, you know, the person who's going to wear the thing at the end. Whereas, you know, perhaps previously couture, you know, the client was, you know, she was going to wear it once or twice at a party maybe, and that was it. Whereas Raf does seem to talk a bit about, you know, her having a life and bringing these garments into her everyday life and the things that she does.
Yeah, she's not like an abstract idea of a woman.
Yeah,
she's
and certainly from my point of view that's interesting because I'm interested in sustainability, and so this idea that a garment which is incredibly well made and crafted and carefully produced would be then have some longevity and be you know, used repeatedly rather than just for, you know, the Met Gala or something, you know, once.
That notion of sustainability, it's interesting when we were talking about that time thing, because I wanted to ask you about this obviously because, as you say, it's kind of your forte and you look a lot at like new systems for fashion. And it's been interesting to see people thinking about the future aesthetically. Do you think that that's is it too surface level? Are people thinking about it too much as kind of aesthetics, not enough as actually like, okay, but how are we making the clothes?
Well, that's why I think he's interesting. It's interesting that he's gone to couture, because in one way, couture, you could say, is the most sustainable end of fashion, if Primark is the other end, and you know, the waste and consumption that's associated with that. Making something that is intended to be kept for 50 years or 100 years or handed on to your grandchildren is much more sustainable. So, you know, there's an argument for that, isn't there?
What is really an impossible question, but what do you think is, because sustainability, there's so many different ways of approaching it. Who's getting it right? What is, in your version of sustainability, how is it going to work?
Well, I hope everything will become couture. I would like a kind of return to that in a way that, you know, that. Do you agree? Do you disagree?
No, I agree.
I just think you're never going to stop people consuming, are you? It's so hard.
I'm all for slow fashion.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm all for it when it first sort of came about. I mean, Primark makes me want to be sick. I see a brown paper bag, those huge ones that people bring onto the tube, and it's created this sort of cultural, social sort of dilemma where if you feel like you shouldn't be able to say to people those clothes, it's this whole idea of should and shouldn't, but you know, you're basically enabling people to shop and buy 30 pieces and make themselves feel like they've got more money than they have, when who's it being made by, and those prices just make you want to be sick, because you see it and you just know that it's been made in a certain way.
But it is hard to criticise it without sounding like you are
it's
criticising democratic fashion, but it's not really democratic.
And it feels like you feel like you're being classist, because you feel like you're denying people of the right to shop. And I literally, again, I could go off.
It's really hard. No, it's interesting though. It's really hard because I just don't think the notion of kind of making something or having something made or customised is just something that most, you know, I've said to friends when they've like, oh, it doesn't fit really well, I'm like, yeah, but it looks great, or like go and take it to a tailor, and just that doesn't exist, I think, as a notion for sort of...
Nobody has patience. They're not gonna, you know, we know how busy our lives are. If we need something adjusting or taking up, when, you know, there are certain things that you just never get around to sorting out, but people are just, it's the immediacy thing. You know, we were talking about it the other day on the Margiela panel. You know, it's everything, it's newism, it's the internet, it's, you know, if something's broken now, you know, like my father said a few years ago, well, a long time ago actually, I forget how old I am, sorry. I keep thinking that was a few years ago and it was like 1,000 years ago. You know, if something's broken now, you can't even get in it to fix it. You just chuck it away. So it's this sort of disposable tech, disposable whatever, and all this, you know, the idea.
But I think there's a kind of a fight against that now, and I think that almost that's kind of coming to the end. I think there's something else is bubbling up.
I think so too. It's an exciting. That's the thing about us being in this cultural sort of vacuum and this idea that it feels a bit like we're lost. But I think, like you said, that we are sort of. Who knows? I literally have no idea what's coming. But like you said, there's all these little sort of indicators, and you know, and it's really growing. You know, we might say, oh, there's, you know, I think that's the thing. People that actually, this felt quite sort of lefty at one point, but now it's really sort of, you know, it's like this tipping point of a trend before you know it.
But I worry because I agree that there's something sort of, you know, even just young people buying stuff secondhand, but you see how that can be commodified so easily, because I think, and commercialised, you know, you think, I remember when that kind of the vintage boom happened and it felt really great and really sustainable and exciting that, you know, like, I remember reading like when Elle did that junior magazine, like Elle Girl, and it was all about customising, like the whole magazine, that was like the big narrative. It was like, you know, so many stories on like how you could cut up your clothes and change them and dye them, and
but Elle's
but no, you'd never see that anymore. But also that's become, look at what Saint Laurent is now. It's vintage, remade, sold for more money. So it's kind of, it worries me that as soon as something becomes a trend or cool, you know, young people making their own clothes, you then get, you know, we see tie-dye on runways, we see
it gets eaten on,
yeah, it does.
and it just becomes tokenism. So it's like, hey, we're going to do this feature on, you know, this special. It's like, you know, when Vogue Italia did the black issue and then just didn't shoot black models for whatever, allegedly, whatever. I don't want to get into deep, but you know, it's that idea that was tokenistic.
Yeah.
ID, when they did the black special, it meant something, and actually they shoot black models. So hello, it has some credibility. But whenever anyone's creating a special out of something, and really it just ends up not being, well, for starters, all their advertisers would go up in arms if they kept continuing with this angle. Because of course, as a magazine, you have this sort of allegiance towards getting to people to buy stuff. Because without that, you haven't got a business model, because it's advertising and consumption fundamentally that keeps those magazines going. So maybe mags would do it more, but they're unfortunately in a bit of a stranglehold with advertisers.
But then the internet's becoming the same, isn't it? Because the focus has always got to be on new and clickbait, and it's kind of, I wonder where that space is to talk about things like sustainability when it pertains to fashion. When, you know, fashion online, it's about pace, it's about putting up more and more content and
look at like what like Topshop and places like that have done to vintage. They all went out to LA. They started going out there like whatever 7 years ago, and they started going, that one dress that one girl would have worn, we'll take it back to London, we'll make 16,000 of them, and everybody's wearing them up and down, you know, in the land, in the student union, and it takes away the individualism of actually finding.
And that was the whole
piece.
Point of wearing
that was the whole point of it.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? They take it and they bastardise the actual
exactly what
spiritual thing behind it.
Yes. But is there not, that's a bigger issue, isn't it? Because is there not an irony whenever we see the past kind of referenced in a catwalk show? Because I guess maybe that is actually explaining what a strength of RAF is that it never feels like it's just kind of like a remaking of something old. It's always something old mixed into something new. Because it is upsetting when you're there and you see like a great vintage look biker and you know it's going to be like $2,000 and you think, you know, what message is that sending people? It's like, oh, don't bother to go and try and find yourself a great vintage biker, just buy this one. But he never does it. He never just copies something. It never feels like, you know, that's just a dress from the 70s.
He plays with it. He plays with it, and all good designers do that. They kind of, you know, they'll take elements of the past and elements of the future and mix them together. You know, whether it's in a new material or, you know, taking something that would have been very heavy and making it very light. That's kind of.
Yeah, and I mean the brilliant thing about him is that he still operates in the codes of Dior. You know, that bar jacket is always in his collections, or that you know that flared skirt. I think which is so clever, really.
And he always does two pieces, doesn't he? In all his collections, he'll rework two pieces. I think original pieces, which is kind of, you know, it's nice to have a homage to the originator. Should we see what he's done?
Yeah, I'm conscious of he throws up so much debate. So just to give you some information. So firstly, the show, you can see aspects of the set, but it really is this kind of huge, like space-agey alien construction that all kind of walking through. It almost looks like a weird sort of thing that you put animals inside, like a hamster construction. All these bars going around. It's incredible. And he's talked about a moonage daydream. So it's an alien journey through the past ideas to the future to reach the point of today. So it's kind of exactly what we were just talking about. So he looks to the romance of near past, when space age and mind-expanding ideas of future felt full of possibilities for society, pop culture and fashion. So it's literally what we were all talking about. We are on an intellectual path.
I actually haven't seen the show, just to say. So.
Have you not?
No, I'm not.
And he says, you know, I was always thinking of the future for so many years and I was always anti-romanticising the past, but the past can be beautiful too. There is a sense of romance of the 50s with the experimentation of the 60s and the liberation of the 70s in the collection, both in its materialisation and attitude. But I really wanted to express something that felt relevant today, learnt from then, from the point of view of now, something wilder, more sexual, strange, and certainly more liberated for the haute couture and for women. So it is what we were talking about with this kind of mash of different decades. What do we think of what we've seen? So you see it quite obviously just in those three looks. It's a really good example, actually, isn't it, of the mix?
Ziggy Stardust.
I know, it's very... I'm a big onesie fan, so I'm really glad that we're seeing a couture psychedelic one. It's lovely.
And the 50s are there as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he talks about them like being like tattoo body suits. So it's really interesting how he does it, going back to what we were talking about with this old and new thing and kind of high and low. You know, you can imagine him doing one of his RAF collections about groups and tattoos, and how he always brings that kind of slightly street aspect or slightly subversive element into the couture.
It's like Rosie was saying, though, he's got that outsider quality. You know, he's always been entrenched in street culture, and this is why, you know, I mean, street culture is obsessed with rap. Actually, it does have that, still has that real sort of credibility out there at that level as well.
It's interesting some of the fabrics he's used this season, because there is a lot of plastic in it. You know, a lot of the people who are watching the show, you know, a lot of social media was like plastic fantastic, so much plastic, and I think that's interesting as well, how it's not just a clash of ideas or inspirations, it's also a clash of this kind of high and low, right down to how the clothes are actually made. Like the footwear, we'll see when we see the close-ups, so they're kind of like over the knee boots with this really futuristic heel and kind of rubbery, and
it does have courage kind of.
It's really interesting. And it's interesting to see it extend just beyond kind of aesthetic into how the pieces are actually made.
Exactly, in the 50s and the 60s, there was such an emergence of new materials coming through, all these, you know, plastics and what have you.
So then again, in the light of our sustainability conversation, is it recycled?
Well, it might be a new vision.
Maybe.
It's interesting. Just to,
sorry. No, I was just going to say, I think this sort of fetishistic boots are really good, because suddenly it makes it really, it makes it really current. You think it's not an exact referencing of this particular, you know, it suddenly shakes up that sort of little 60s boxy mini dress with these kind of
a little bit more ominous.
And it's interesting, can we just go back to the couple of looks before that? It's interesting, just, you know, we were talking about the kind of Dior things he always references, and I always think of the waist when you think of Dior, and it's interesting how, you know, he's making the emphasis on the waist there, and this kind of like crop toppy wear, and I love how he can take something really, really subtle about a Dior code and then work with it. You know, those tops, you wouldn't, it's not a classic Dior shape at all, but then you can see its history back in kind of, I love number 17 because it reminds me of that dress, you know, where she wears in Pretty Woman when she first gets picked up, and it's got the ring and she's wearing over the knee boots. But it is that dress, but it's just merged with it.
Right, it's quite hookerish.
I know, it is. It's kind of, well, he's talked about it. He said that he wants it to be really sensory, and he has actually, in the quote that he's given sort of as the show notes, he does talk about it being sexual, which I think is really interesting, because when you think of couture, you think of this idea of untouchability. Naturally, you know, you want the pieces to be so beautiful that you kind of are almost sort of in awe of them, but then I don't think that feels very fashionable. I think most women don't want to look untouchable, even if they're wearing Celine, which kind of sells itself on it being incredibly chic and removed. It is this idea of a trouser that puddles to the floor and you're running in your trainer. This idea of being very sort of, you know, cab to bar stool to back to cab doesn't feel very chic anymore.
No, it's got to have that, and I mean, it's quite a bit of Prada running through this for me as well. That ugliness, like obviously we know all about that. Sorry, but you know, it's got to have that sort of that, like you said, that kind of that edge about it to make it feel. I guess that's really what, you know, you've got to have that curve. And
that's
23.
amazing.
It's exactly what you're saying, isn't it? That kind of. It's just, it's like an opera coat but in plastic. It's really strange.
And I think it's really interesting you mentioned about the fetish, this sort of reference, because in a way what we've been talking about is actually how fashion and rap is a major part of that, is actually fetishizing the era itself. So actually then he brings that into the clothes, and it's like this sort of kind of, you know, obsession that he has, and it's really quite sexy, some of it, isn't it?
It really is. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you wouldn't, I don't think this idea of being sexy and wearing couture as things combined, but going back to what Oriole was saying, you know, if young women are spending on couture, of course they want to look attractive and beautiful in perhaps a more traditional sense. It's interesting.
But, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think the other interesting thing here is that he's really pushing the ateliers too. Because I know, having spoken to somebody who works with him, that he was bringing all these fabrics and plastics and things initially to, you know, the ateliers and saying, what can we do with this? And they were saying,
they were like, nothing. Go away.
So, you know, and gradually, you know, this is really interesting that he is, you know, sort of
it's interesting, isn't it? I love that when I interviewed JW Anderson recently, and he kind of talked about that, this idea of like the joy that some designers get from challenging the amazing craftsmen that they had, and he just kept saying, you know, and where they teams that work with the leather, you know, use them to do amazing things. And I think it's interesting because you look at this and you feel like there's been experimentation, and even if some of the ideas don't gel that well, you're still happy to see, you know, plastic being worked on by these sort of master craftsmen. It's amazing.
But it's very much textile, isn't it? The experimentation, for me anyway, is kind of in the textile and in the layering rather than in the cutting, which would be, you know, if you were to compare it, for example, with what Hussein did at Widening. It's, you know, which is so much more about the cutting.
The cutting,
So it's kind of interesting contrast. It's very textile.
There's still those very clean silhouettes, really. That sort of very cool.
I mean, if you put them in a white fabric, for example, the forms are very simple.
And very kind of tied to, I think, what he's done with Dior, but also what Dior, as Oriole was saying, you know, what Dior was about, the kind of the shape. You are saying this now, looking at like a sequin onesie.
I would look so bad in number 41. I challenge anybody to look good in 41.
But they remind me of those shopping bags that he did as well. But, you know, it's the comments on
sweets.
the consumerism, you know, the kind of striped shopping bags.
Christopher Shannon did that this season for the Menswear. He did, you know, those really cheap bags, like the blue and white stripe and the red and white stripe. He did trousers that were like
exactly,
that.
and I think it's commenting on that same thing again, it's consumerism, and I think that, you know, the 50s was, you know, Prada is so obsessed with the 50s for all kinds of reasons. You know, the word teenager didn't even exist before the 50s. All kinds of huge cultural booms happened, but all these really sort of nasty man-made fabrics arrived, which she works with a lot from the 50s, and it's this sort of turning point towards sort of real, I guess, mass consumption. You know, everybody, you know, fabrics that could be made en masse very quickly, and it's all the time commentating on consumerism and consumption and that turning point.
Which is apt for this collection in a way, because this does feel like a big step on for him. It feels like a departure from previous seasons, because we talked a lot about his work feeling kind of clean and fresh, and I think, you know, and I don't mean it as a criticism, this is messier than we would expect for him. You know, it feels kind of like things pulled from everywhere. There's not the same kind of slickness and lightness that we'd expect. It does feel like the kind of rapid nature of fashion is something that he's actually kind of toying with and playing with and using to create something quite interesting, because it feels messy.
Like I think these work, these 51 to 53 together.
And then I think
really
44 to 46 as well, where again it was that sort of classic 50s silhouette, but they look so sort of strong. They looked really, they didn't look pretty or retrospective. They, you know, there was something quite strong. And, I think just going back, these 44 to 46, these three
I think
here.
it feels like it's his collection. I think maybe in previous ones, you know, there's been kind of like trying to find a balance between, you know,
honouring history.
And this feels like it's fully his now.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's something interesting to think about with working at a house with such a heritage, because there's not that long of Mr. Dior himself to reference. You know, it's just 10 years, and I think people forget that a lot. And you know, they talk about Dior and be like, well, it's, you know, a house sort of steeped with history, and of course it is, but also it's not in some weird ways. And I think that's interesting, is how he works with the kind of the Dior codes and how he makes them his own, because there's not really a wealth of material there. You know, he's done the bar jacket. Well,
I think it's very difficult for any designer going in, isn't it? I mean, whether it's Schiaparelli or whether it's even for Karl Lagerfeld or Chanel, you know, all the original designers were such revolutionaries in what they did, and then it's quite difficult to then come in and be as revolutionary, you know.
And do we think with this, I mean, it's interesting, we all sort of feel that this is more Raf Simons than any other Dior.
It is.
And is in the game of fashion top trumps. You know, Galliano is back in the game now. You know, since he's been at Dior, there hasn't been, I won't say the spectre, but, you know, for somebody taking on a mantle, that's very present. And so, you know, Galliano
is so different.
Galliano's come back, and, you know, is it the fact that the game is sort of raised? I mean, look at the set. Is such a departure from the flowers, I think, that were, you know, he's used so consistently.
I think it's interesting because you get the sense that it just feels so different, which is what I've never actually met Raf, I don't know him at all, but he just doesn't come across like the kind of character that would ever care, you know, what someone else was doing. It feels like he has such a precise point of view, and I think that comes through in the fact that this just feels so different.
I think it's really interesting, because I think, like, tapping into what you were saying, like, it feels so much more confident. But the thing is that Raf came from a place that was fundamentally very sort of industrial in terms of design, but now he's gone
and it's the second time he's done it, because he had to go into Jill Sander before.
Yeah,
so he's
absolutely.
actually used to the idea of
That's
going
really
in
good point, yeah.
But the idea of like, there's a lot of industrial references here, like the yellow and the orange and that great yellow jacket. But it's a perfectly built collection, because you know, there's 4 looks for, you know, Tatler, there's 4 looks for ID, and everything, there'll be something for everyone. Similarly for, you know, whoever's stocking them, and the buyers, there will be something for everyone. So, but I think he's come from the cleaner palette, which is more now, and he's gone towards, like, he's playing here with print, silhouette, colour, he's going for it. Some of it's really, really
But
quite
he is kind of a master of surface. You know, that is Raf's strength. If you look at his collections under his own name, he is so good with graphics and making something kind of really iconic that's very surface level. And it's interesting that he does it in a way which people never seem to think is kind of gimmicky. But he's very good at making...
It used to be a lot more black. I mean, when I was on the Raf panel for autumn, winter, you know, there were certain people on the panel there that really sort of mourn the years where there is that sort of like almost sort of spiritual kind of like anonymity, purity around his work. And I think that fashion has become more colourful and print orientated now, because like we said, it's like everything needs to be instantly like, I pop, whether it be on the internet or what have you.
Yeah, you don't have to work hard to appreciate it. It's kind of right in your face.
You maybe can appreciate it like a couple of different levels.
It's interesting just that some like that orange, it really reminds me of the collection he did, you know, the father's collection, I always call it. That orange is so, it was kind of everywhere at Fashion Week, and it's interesting just how he's very good at that, I think, very good at making things immediately likeable, even if they are kind of, as we were saying, a little bit...
Some of it's quite...
offish.
Yeah, some of it's very off. I mean, some of it's a real sort of, in terms of that sort of Prada sort of redigest that you have to do, go back and love things that you maybe didn't like on first viewing, or because there's so much to sort of to take in.
It's interesting also talking about Galliano as you raised, Oriole, because I think one thing I felt very interesting about what he did last season with the couture is it did feel like he'd looked at the Galliano Dior years and, you know, was referencing that. It was kind of more historical, you know, like the frock coats and all of that. And I wonder if there's just kind of a confidence thing. He's been there a bit longer now.
That's what it looks like to me. It looks like a much more confident, it's him. It's a kind of, there's enough reference to Dior, but it's his collection, whereas the previous ones, it feels like he was kind of finding his way. You know, there was the trip round the world, and then there's the trip through time, and now he's kind of like, he's found his place a little bit, maybe.
I absolutely love this.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting because it's very different to what he's done before.
He's so confident, like we said, and I just love it. He looks like he's running on full steam ahead.
He talked about the kind of the Dior woman, the femme fleur, being subverted and kind of liberated. And I think liberation's a really good word. It's kind of like a bit manic, but in a brilliant way, where you can imagine that there was so much joy put into it, you know, both and kind of frustration and emotion. I imagine like trying to work with plastic, and as we were talking about, you know, it's really exciting when you see that kind of like lots of ideas.
It's almost got a Rodarte subversiveness to it, and I'm obsessed with Laura.
But then that's then going to be interesting to see, as we were talking about how fluid this conversation was between his own work and then what he's doing for Dior, what will, you know, how that will carry on, whether the lines between, you know, the couture and his own line are going to start to merge.
I like it when you see it in the most subtle things, you know, like the 5 buttons and things like that. I just but this is so different to the collection we saw for his men's. You know, I thought the collection for his men's, it was quite sad in a way. You know, it was, he's looking back to his own childhood and bullies, and it was quite, there was this kind of, it was very teenage, and the looks were very long, and it really looked like people who were growing, and they were kind of uncomfortable with their own bodies, and the pieces were really beautiful, but you know, there was an oddness to them. You know, those flares, they were kind of more than a flare. They looked like someone who wasn't quite comfortable in their figure.
Maybe that's
really
because
interesting.
he is a man, and so here he's dressing women. You know, so maybe there's a separation somehow that happens between his menswear and womenswear.
No, that's interesting to think about it like that. Actually,
you know, it is amazing. He's only been doing womenswear for 10 years. I think. Which is incredible. You know, that's something.
No, it is interesting that. It feels like some of the most exciting designers I always think about this, and I always bring it up on panels and no one else wants to talk about it apart from me. It's interesting that so many of the most exciting designers around for women trained as menswear designers. I think it's a real thing that you're seeing. You know, you have it
or
with
furniture designers.
Exactly. But I wonder, it's so interesting. You know, I was thinking a lot about it with J.W. Anderson and also like, you know, Eddie Slimane and so many designers who didn't kind of want to be a women's wear designer, who weren't obsessed with kind of like, because I'm obsessed with Craig Green and I really want him to do women's wear because I just think he would be so good at it, and it's really interesting to think about.
Well, maybe there's something about the discipline of menswear, because it is so subtle, and because you do have to really work so hard to kind of, you know, get your message across. But then when there is a, you know, that some of that
more consideration, perhaps. Yeah, that's interesting.
Freedom of women's wear is kind of quite exciting then.
I think menswear designers understand luxury better than women's designers.
Yeah,
I think they understand fabrication better, because like you said, they have they can't run the full gamut and give us this in menswear. So they're more sort of discerning when it comes to understanding materials and silhouettes and eras. So they actually probably are better designers in a sense, because they can't just flash the cash and do an Instagram splurge and go for it. Like, I mean, these
shove some sequins on it.
Yeah, absolutely, and add some value. When there are designers.
Yeah, there's male shoppers who want that more and more. I think you are seeing that creep into the menswear. It's quite interesting, things that are very gimmicky and very, you know, as men become more interested in fashion and more versed in fashion.
My goodness, I mean, print's just overtaken women's wear. I mean, especially like London designers for quite a while. I mean,
that's why it's interesting to see him do print, because print feels really passé, I think.
I think so.
But then Prada did that Faces collection, you know, not that long ago, and I think that kind of, I felt like they did that just at that point where print was really done, and now it's kind of creeping back in a really interesting way. And it feels like it's less about print and more about graphics and more about colours, and that's
I think
interesting.
That's really true. I think it is very much about having a graphic impact really quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Depends who's doing it and what it means contextually.
Which, given what we were talking about earlier and about the fact that he was so influenced by the Antwerp Six, is so opposite in a way from that whole ethos, isn't it? Which was all about kind of...
But he could do both. It was so interesting when he did that Dior Couture collection. It was like all black and white. It was so pared back in a sense. It was really palette cleansing.
But that's an interesting point then. You know, does he have a signature then? You know, in the way that if you think about Margiela, if you think about kind of, you know... Well,
but his signature's like modernity, isn't
it?
it?
They have such a sort of, you know what you're getting.
Well, I think he has a sentimentality. You know, we could literally.
What would be his signature then?
His obsession with uniforms, like this, you know, childhood, the schoolboy, understanding where.
But that's
a
more abstract. So it's not like, you know, some designers there's a cut, there's like a real you can recognise.
For me,
you can recognise the Queen's shoulder, for example.
For me, mid 20th century sort of like beautiful Grace Kelly kind of shapes, but very clean. Do you know what I mean?
I think he's more slippery. I think he's
I agree with you. Down. I think he is harder
for women's wear. I'm talking.
But it's not so clear.
But I think Prada's really like that as well. I think when you think of Prada's signature, I think she's a great colorist, and I think about she's great with fabrics. You know, bad fabrics I see as like a Prada signature, but it is hard to be like, you know, shoes. You can be like, that's a Prada shoe, but it's harder to be like, oh, that's a real Prada shade. It's kind of the same with Marc Jacobs, kind of the same with Celine. I think it's interesting. I think these designers that are very good at putting together references and ideas rather than making great clothes. Which is, again, not to say they're not good at clothes.
Perhaps what you have to be when you're in this position. You have to. That's kind of the skill that you need rather than that kind of single message.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
There's a certain colour palette that he works with as well.
Yeah, I do think that's true.
These textures.
It's incredible. I know we're like skipping past it. It's so amazing.
That's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
45 and 46.
Yeah.
And I love the contrast between the kind of lightness in 46 and kind of the intricacy of that. It almost looks like it's, you know, grown out of the earth. And then that like real plasticky, it's really, really strange.
I actually prefer this collection in the detail shots
to
the kind
But that's, I think, what I was talking about right at the start, is that, you know, it's great that we do have these close-ups, and you hope that these will be the ones that kind of are all over Instagram and all over Tumblr, because it's just so hard, I think, in couture when it's kind of that removed catwalk image to get across how spectacular it is, especially if it is, you know, short.
I think also it makes more sense. I mean, certainly those 45, 46 where you see the kind of the very shiny leg with this very kind of opulent textile. I mean, I don't know. It has these two, that feels.
Well, it has that organic element next to the real sort of.
Well, it's almost a bit Blade Runner-ish as well, kind of.
Yeah, it's so true.
And again, that worked because it was old and new together, wasn't it? That was what made that film amazing.
Wow.
I wonder how long it took to get all the girls into their boots. I bet that was really stressful backstage. We were really bad for whoever was dressing the models.
Fun job though.
Yeah, fun job, but like awful.
And I know exactly what you mean, Rosie, because these, you know, close-ups, that they are like almost appreciating a look in a new kind of, it feels like, oh my God, I love that picture of that close-up. Say, for example, even the line of the way they've sort of photographed, my eyesight's not very good, number 50. You can see the sort of the sculpture of the dress and better than you could if it was just full look.
Where it does look more pret-a-porter from a distance.
Yes,
and
totally.
Then here is where you can really appreciate it.
And this is really architectural, and then you can see all the fabrication, and
which I guess gets into this idea of who couture is for, because you know, the fact that it looks better close up, you think, well, good, because it should be for whoever's wearing it and bought it, and you know, it shouldn't, obviously you want it to look great from a distance, but it is this idea that, you know, when you wear it, it feels really, really spectacular. The use of plastic becomes even more interesting. You can see it so much better in the close-ups.
And is there like a cherry blossom kind of branch print on the plastic jackets or something?
Yeah, the cherry blossom.
Sort of.
there's a Japanese vibe.
Yeah, I think 49 is sort of has.
But then you do think Dior and flowers, don't you? Obviously Lily of the Valley, but it's just something that you kind of think about, and Dior and roses and.
Yeah, so 49 and 51 feels slightly Japanese kind of print.
It's really, really amazing. I just love the plastics.
It's phenomenal.
I feel terrible saying that I like the plastic, but I do.
Like, I hate the plastic. But I love it.
I should hate plastic in all forms, but
those orange
Courage
boots.
boots.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
They're really, really good. I can't wait to see some really bad high street rip-offs of those and poor girls with their heels smashed on a nice. I love the Pretty Woman dress. That's my favourite.
The pleating is really interesting. Actually.
I prefer the skirts.
Oh, so pretty.
But it's that really weird mix of kind of real kind of modernity and looking like that doesn't. It's a very historical shape, and then that pleating makes it look really kind of like.
Yeah, so plasticky. Almost,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting.
It's really interesting because it has this you know, with Margiela, the upcycling kind of element.
Yeah.
I just think it's so interesting. I mean, Raph is obsessed with Margiela. I went to see his show in '91 and obviously cried, as he does. But the word is on the street. I don't know whether this was ever official, but he was kind of offered the job at Margiela, but didn't feel like he could take it because it was too much for him to be designing for Margiela. Weirdly enough, obviously John's gone from Dior to Margiela, and now he's at Dior. So it's like he didn't feel like he could take Margiela, but he could take on Dior.
But maybe it's in that sense of
sorry,
musical chairs.
It's so interesting, but actually, like, this is where all these designers connect for me, and I just feel that we're witnessing some wonderful designs.
But that's interesting, that sense of removal. You know, you don't get the sense that Raph studied the House of Dior at any point during his fashion career and really tried to reference it and was obsessed with it in the way that he was saying Margiela, and maybe that's what makes him so good for it, because there's that lightness of touch with all the reference. You know, it's not something that he's kind of overwhelmed by. And
you're right, I think he got into it at Jill Sander, didn't he?
Yeah, those last three collections.
Yes!
Sort of,
The trilogy.
So he's starting to look at it.
But it does make sense though, because he was interested in these closed worlds, wasn't he?
Yeah.
These kind of, you know, secret societies almost, and couture is another one.
Yeah, that's very true.
I love that.
Yeah, his idea of groups, you know, that is interesting. But I think he likes that, like communities, routines, traditions, and even like new traditions, you know, like habits within groups. I think that's something that always interests him, you know, from the youth culture perspective. And there's so much of that in couture, and so much of it not just in the kind of the buying of couture and the shopping of couture in the couture world with those women who buy, but also in the making of couture. You know, these weird hierarchies.
But that's where I think it would be really interesting to see if he could do anything with that. You know, the system. Of
yes,
it.
I love this.
Not just the aesthetic,
but anthropologically, you know, as a system. I love it.
Because then it could become more sustainable too.
What would you like to see him do?
Well, I think maybe, as you were saying, the sort of the craft element, the sort of handmade, the fact that couture is shown in the same way as pret-a-porter, it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's not until you see, as you said, these close-ups that you see the amount of work involved, and maybe there's you know, I think it was the first 4 or 5 years or something, he didn't actually show on the catwalk, did he? He showed in different ways.
Yes,
so,
and video and stuff.
I don't know, maybe there's another way of kind of thinking about couture.
I think it would be so interesting if someone who is at one of these houses, which is going back to those Margiela sort of toiles on the runway, is sort of educating and informing people about the craft that goes into couture, because it's just so incredibly interesting, and I think it's only ever really told, and it's told really well at things like exhibitions. You know, when you see sort of new or historical couture, and that's when that story is told.
Exactly, but not in the present.
But not in relation to the present. And I always think about it with the Chanel show, you know, the Métier d'Art show, because even the way that's kind of, I guess maybe it's a media issue, it's not so much kind of the responsibility of the houses, but you know, that show is meant to be about celebrating those ateliers.
But maybe they're missing a trick then, because it's not necessarily a responsibility, but it's an opportunity. It's
an opportunity,
you know, to actually tell that story. And, you know, there's a community around all of these garments would have been created by a whole, you know, team of amazing people. So that's a great story.
Think, you know, people love to have something that's like, they love showing off their clothes, and I think, you know, what better if people. But I just wonder, does handmade, or you know, this had this many hours working to it, feel like an exciting thing to say to people? I don't know.
I think it's building traction.
Do you?
For the first time in my life, I'm thinking about making my own clothes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just I think that the investing time in something.
Well, I think time is the key thing, because that's the expense, isn't it? That's the value, is the amount of kind of time involved.
And it's funny, actually, if you go up until the 1980s, people made their own clothes, you know, which is amazing. Actually, you think of paper patterns. You know, there was that culture,
and it's coming back on YouTube. You know, there's lots of people. You know.
The phenomenon of the YouTube tutorial.
Exactly.
That's
well, even like, is it kind of wool in the gang when you can send off for a knitting pattern,
or you can buy the garment?
It's becoming very hipster, of course. It's in danger of that, but
and
I do think that will start. Absolutely, I do think that will start becoming more.
We think
more
baking became this like massive thing on the internet. You know, everyone shares their pictures of their baking. I think maybe it'll get the same thing where everyone's sharing their pictures of like.
I think so.
Let's make it happen. Do you think there's a kind of interest in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely, but then the reality of it is, when somebody needs a new white T-shirt, are they just going to end up going to, you know, Primark, or will they actually sit down and say, okay, I'm putting aside Saturday afternoon, I'm going to buy my fabric, I'm, you know. So
we should do a panel where everyone has to come in clothes that they've made. I would look very interesting.
But and there is an element of skill too, because some people will never be good at making their own clothes. So, but I think there is definitely a resurgence of interest in the fact that you can make your own clothes, that maybe 5-10 years ago wasn't there. So,
like all these shows on TV are hugely influential on all of this kind of stuff. That, like you said, like Great British Bake Off or Sewing Bee, I kind of look and go, "Ooh, that looks really difficult," and I wouldn't have the patience for it. But why is it that we can't do it?
Yeah, and I do think that's something that Raf gets into. I think this notion of like customization and how clothes are made is something he's played with for a few seasons. I really thought about that with the Sterling. I don't know if it's Sterling Ruby or Ruby Sterling. I get it wrong every time. Sterling Ruby. There we go. That collection that seemed to play with that, not just in the paint splatters, but the way it was kind of like imagery stuck on in a way that you could almost imagine a kid doing, you know, when you could iron on things onto your clothes, and even like the way the pockets were shrunk and moved up, it looked like it was very much about crafting clothes being made and things being moved and positioned, and it does look like tape stuck on clothes. It looks and it's interesting to think about that notion of making.
It's the same. I don't want to talk about postmodernism again. This is so boring. But it's this DIY aesthetic. You know, like the Lee Bowery, like wrapping himself in police tape and going into the Blitz Club and saying, "This is my outfit."
And it's interesting because Kim Jones at Vuitton did Christopher Nemeth this season. That was his thing. It was all Christopher Nemeth. So it feels like there's like a moment for that notion.
But it's that idea that you can create a moment, and you can, and things do look like collages and they're stuck on, because it's that idea of like, you know, in the 70s and 80s, pre-internet, sorry, my mind's gone blank. All these packages that sort of help you do sort of kind of, you know, design, or whether it be Photoshop or what have you, or Illustrator. You know, anyone can kind of do something now, but actually when it was just about a pair of scissors, sheet of paper and some sellotape. What could I make out of that? What could you make out of that?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Blue Peter.
A Blue Peter. But it's that idea of kind of the hierarchy of who genuinely is creative.
Yeah. This is the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we couldn't make this probably, you know. And so then that's part of its value.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
that's what I think's really kind of almost getting lost a little bit.
Yeah.
Like we're sort of zooming in when there are these close-ups and getting excited. But from a distance, it's hard to kind of read.
So is it something about, as you've also touched on, the fact of the way the houses present couture, there isn't enough of a demarcation. And it's something you said, I think, a while ago, which was really interesting about having a jacket made, that until you actually experience that, you don't know what the fuss is
for
about.
example, like a Savile Row suit, everybody knows that. The narrative's really evident, isn't it? And when you go to have a suit made, I've never had one made, I'd love to, but you know what's involved, and I think less so if you're looking at this, it's not as part of the story.
But then it's like couture's kind of damned in that sense, because you know the best way I think for people to know about how brilliant couture is never going to be seeing an image of it or even kind of seeing it from afar. It is going to be touching it and looking inside it and you know, if possible, trying it on, and there just isn't that opportunity.
But so maybe that's the intimate relationship, that the client has to have something other than everybody else. Do you know what I mean? We don't get to put it on, we don't get to touch it. That's the whole, I think there's got to be some next level, hashtag next level type stuff. Do you think?
I do agree.
I think it needs to stay special in some way, for sure.
But I know what you mean, it stops that. I mean, we're losing tactility, you know, we're not touching stuff anymore, we're just looking at screens.
But maybe there's a way of conveying that through the screen better than they do.
Which
perhaps.
I think this is a really interesting collection for that, because we all said it's incredibly tactile as a collection, and that does come across really well on the screen. You know, the boots look vinyl-y, rubbery, you know, I think that's really interesting. So we're impressed with what he's done. Is this a good...
I think this is the most him.
I think
really
so.
does.
It's really strong.
No, it's really, really great. There's, it just throws up a lot of interesting discussions, and it makes me want to go and watch Pretty Women. So that's tonight planned, which is perfect. Should we give him a round of applause then to round things up?